Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled The Great Transformation. It is going to be a conversation with a special guest that I'm going to introduce in a minute. But before I do that, let me just spend a few words introducing FGB, which is the organization I work in the capacity of head of innovation, and the topic of today. So FGB is a think and do tank working on evidence-based policy design and evaluation. We work at a European level. We've been doing this for 50 years. And today we are, I think, placed in a very special moment in the life of our continent, as both the Green Deal and the Next Generation EU are paving the way for a transformation of our societies and our economies. And the name of this transformation is actually digital and sustainable transformation. Now, the question that the continent will have to face is, are we going to be able to go from a very niche part of our economy that deals with sustainability and green, or are we able to go mainstream and actually transform the way that our economies and our societies work and live within the boundaries of our planet? And today we have the fortune to talk about this very crucial topic for Europe with James Shaw. James Shaw is Minister for Climate Change and Associate Minister for the Environment and the Biodiversity for the New Zealand government. It's at its second mandate. He has done some very interesting things in his first mandate and in this first part of his second mandate. And we think is the best person to talk with about this topic. James, are you there?
Good morning.
There you go, James. Welcome.
Buongiorno.
Ciao. Now, let's take the bias out of this. We have been knowing each other and we've been friends for 25 years. So we have been talking about these topics for 25 years almost. We've been working on sustainability together. So I know a little bit about the way you think. And so I would like to start with the question that brings out the capacities that I've always recognized in you as a visionary leader, now in politics, but before in the private sector. So what is sustainability to you, and how are you working at the government level to actually enact this transformation in New Zealand?
Well, Fabio, first of all, I just want to say it's lovely to see you, and I want to say hello to everybody who's on the seminar. Thank you for joining. Look, I'm an environmentalist, and so I have a bias in my language towards the planetary boundaries that we must live within if we're to have a sustainable society and a sustainable economy. But I think it is really important that we consider those environmental limits, whether they be the ability of the atmosphere to absorb the greenhouse gases that we put into it, or the ability of the soil to sustain the way that we do agriculture, or the ability of our waterways and our oceans to absorb and process the pollution that we put into it from our waste streams and so on, that really is just a foundation, and that ultimately a sustainable society also has to pay very close attention to its socioeconomic conditions as well. And so, we know, for example, that when you stretch the ratio between, people at the bottom of the pile in terms of their income and people who accumulate wealth at the top, when that stretches beyond a certain point, that's when societies start to break down and you start to get social discord and ultimately, revolutions or civil war and so on. And so I don't think that we've actually got a terribly good idea, actually, of being able to measure that. Whereas the biophysical limits, in some ways, although they're very complicated, are more straightforward because it's a matter of biology and physics and chemistry, ultimately. And these things are easier for us to determine than the more nebulous kind of human functions that hold our societies together. So ultimately, that to me is what a sustainable society is. And what sustainability is the ability to live within our limits, both in a environmental sense and in a socioeconomic sense. And I think Kate Raworth sums it up far more articulately than I ever could when she talks about the donut economy, with those kind of two sets of boundaries that we need to live within to create a safe operating space for humanity. What are we doing with it in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Well, we're kind of busy with all of the above, partially because we've had a long period of about 30 years in New Zealand where we have underinvested in the kind of infrastructure that supports a healthy society and a sustainable society, but we've also allowed our economy to operate in ways that have contravened those biophysical limits as well. And so we're having now to do quite a lot of remedial work, in part driven by our response to COVID-19 as well. But in the areas that I'm most familiar with, we're, for example, bringing in a new national strategy around waste management that starts with the principle of the circular economy, the idea that you design products and services at the top end to make sure that they actually minimize waste as it goes through, and you design things that can be repurposed and reused over and over and over again before you ultimately think about how they get disposed. Where we have a massive expansion in renewable electricity generation that's starting to occur here, and that's really to support the transition to decarbonising our economy as well. We're, I think, the first country in the world to put in place a measurement and management and pricing system for agricultural greenhouse gases, which our farmers don't think is terribly sustainable, but it is our leading industry, and we need to pay attention to that as well. And the main kind of program that I'm responsible for right across government is, of course, the climate change program, and that involves electricity generation, industrial heat, waste, agriculture, forestry, transport, you name it. And so there isn't really an area of government that climate change doesn't touch upon. And the coordination of all of that is, a heck of an effort for any government. So that's kind of the broad program of what we're doing at the moment.
That sounds really amazing, James. And I recognize that the fact that climate change has a transversal role across government and across all functions of the economy and societies, because a transformation implies the fact that you work at a systemic level on all different kind of levers that you can touch upon to actually enact or enable that transformation. But before we go more into details on specific actions that you've been taking, I just wanted to stay a little bit still up at the vision level and go back to your first remark about the fact that, one of the things that we are just starting to understand with all the limits is whether, the climate change is an effect of human activity, or whether it is, and to what extent that is, and also how far have we already gone, to bring that change which is going to be unsustainable for our planet. And also very interesting, the notion about the fact that changing climate will determine changes across the spectrum. You named the civil wars, you named the displacement of people, you named poverty and the disaster on food systems and agriculture and so on and so forth. And so if on one side the changing climate will determine a disaster at a systemic level, on the other side, the transformation of the way we work towards sustainability can represent an opportunity both at the social and economic level. Is that, in your opinion, something that it's worth pursuing? Now, how do you see that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'll tell you what, if we don't treat this like the biggest opportunity we have to upgrade our societies and our economies in, Lord knows how many generations, then we're not going to succeed in solving the problem. And one of my greatest frustrations is that I think, at least here in Aotearoa, over the course of the last 30 years, and even in the time of our government, it is treated like a sunk cost, like, oh, you know, solving climate change is going to be really expensive, so let's not do it. As if there was a counterfactual that didn't also involve, you know, a lot of money. And I think we're only now starting to work out that actually the solutions to climate change themselves are wildly beneficial, and actually your return on investment is considerable. And some of it's even by fairly traditional economic measures. So I'll give you one. New Zealand imports about 5 billion New Zealand dollars worth of petroleum every year, right? We make a little bit of our own, but what we use for transport is imported for our vehicle fleet. And our balance of payments deficit, you know, we import more than we export, so the balance of payments deficit is about $6 billion. And if we converted our vehicle fleet to electrics, which are powered by renewable energy, which is generated here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, then we wouldn't need to import $5 billion worth of petrol. And at that point, we would be exporting pretty much the same amount as we import, and our balance of payments deficit would change, and that would generate increased wealth for the country. So that's a, you know, kind of a fairly straightforward equation. And the same is true in households. You know, I drive an electric car. It costs me about $10 New Zealand to recharge the battery every week. The petrol car that I used to own cost me about $75 to refill at the tank every week. And so you know, although the upfront cost of the vehicle is more expensive, over the lifetime of that vehicle, my household costs go down. We're actually materially better off as a result of the transition. And almost everything that we do, you know, we're going to need to invest massively in public transport and in mode shift. That hugely benefits low-income families and people for whom transport costs are prohibitive as part of their kind of, you know, daily lives and the sort of work that they need to do. When it comes to agriculture, which is you know, a hard to shift sector, the benefit of reducing the impact on the environment, adding value rather than focusing on volume, means that we actually shift the quality of our products several notches higher, which adds value to those products in our export markets, where you've got some very discerning customers who are really looking for you know, product that has real provenance to it. And I just find it hugely frustrating that the kind of predominant mindset is like, oh, well, hey, you know, how much is this going to cost? So I just think that we have to seize this as an opportunity to increase productivity, to create great new jobs, to create better cities and better lives, to cut congestion, make it easier for people to get around, and so on. And the ancillary benefits of that are huge multipliers of every dollar invested.
When I hear you, it comes to me that probably this is not just a matter of better politics and better public policy, but it's also a matter of cultural understanding of what is at stake on one side and what is the meaning of long-term investment for our societies. Because when you mention the examples that you mentioned, I think it's pretty straightforward that it makes a lot of sense to invest in this green transformation rather than the status quo. And so here comes my next question, because you know, you of course, you know, think and act at the government national level, and you also play a role in the international arena, but at the same time, you know, climate change affects mostly people on the ground and local communities. And when we talk about the disasters, the potential disasters coming from climate change, the people on the ground, the people at the local level are the ones that are going to be really suffering and being affected. So in your view, do they play a role in this transformation? And if they do, what kind of role can they play? And at the same time, what kind of role the government can play, or what kind of function has to, you know, exercise in order to include them in the game?
Yeah, look, Fabio, I think it's a really good question. And I think it's something that central government is singularly bad at empowering and working with local and community level leadership in a way that really empowers their leadership, because the state, almost by necessity, is a kind of a large bureaucratic, fairly lumbering machine. It's not terribly agile, and has rules, to do with the public accountability for the use of money and so on and so forth. And the standard of those rules is often so high, it makes it virtually impossible for communities to really actively participate. I'll use an example of how I think about this. There's quite a significant move here at the moment to empower indigenous communities, so the Maori people of Aotearoa, who were here before the European colonization period, which started in the early 1800s. And they make up about 15%, 16% of the overall population, and heavily integrated, in the overall population, and at the same time have what we call marae, which is like a sort of a tribal meeting place or a central community centre. And there are about 1,000 of these all over New Zealand. And they're often located in areas which are quite vulnerable to things like flood risk, storms, sea level rise, and so on. But they're of deep cultural significance to the tribe that it belongs to. And so the government, there's obviously been a kind of a long and pretty grisly history between the colonizing government and the indigenous people, and it involved, wars and all sorts of things. And we've been trying to restore that relationship and honor that relationship and make some kind of reparations over the course of the last four decades or so. But it's a long journey. And so how we support Maori communities to kind of get through, adapt to the effects of climate change, become more resilient, and how we have this economic transition in a way that actually doesn't simply reinforce those existing inequities, but helps to kind of repair some of that damage that's been done over a long period of time. That's a really important principle. And so really, I think it involves central government having to kind of give up some of its power, some of its money, to actually create a truly partnership arrangement, to say, well, actually, we're going to make available to you the resource that you see is necessary in your community to make these adjustments, and we'll provide, all of the data and the scientific background and everything that you need to be able to make your own decisions, but ensure that you're actually resourced to do so, and take some kind of guidance from the community as to how they want that transition to occur. I think there's often a sense, everybody says, look, what can I do? What can I do at home to make a difference to climate change? What can I do with my family? What can I do with my community? What can I do in my business? And that's a completely, it's great that people want to do that. And individual and community level or grassroots level action is critical, but it requires systemic change to support it. Otherwise, it's just a whole group of individuals and small scale activities which aren't going to be sufficient to kind of meet the challenge at the scale of the challenge, which is gargantuan, biblical in its scale. And so for me, having that mesh of empowered local leadership, empowered Indigenous leadership, empowered youth leadership, empowered business leadership is really critical. And central government has, I think, a critical role to play in providing the foundations upon which that leadership is able to build something over time. And I'd love to, I know that this is your meat and potatoes, as we say, it's your core business. So I'd love to hear about some examples of communities that are working out how to decarbonize themselves and also how to build resilience in the face of the changing climate in ways that are affecting them already.
That's great, James. I think the notion of shared leadership or diffuse leadership that we need to enable this transformation, I think it's key, because we always look up at the the European government or at that level of governance, or the national government or regional governments. In most of European countries, you also have that level of governance to actually enact this transformation. But the power shift that you're talking about, so shifting power from certain hierarchies of governance to local communities, I think it's very important in this transformation. But it will also require for people to take responsibility and accountability for wanting this transformation and leading at the local level this transformation. And I guess that's a cultural challenge. Because if on one side the national state and all the kind of bureaucratic structures that comes with it brought a great deal of progress to our societies, at the same time they sort of, as a perverse effect, they took away from the people the ownership of their own lives in some or a lot of crucial aspects of our lives. So this cultural transformation also, I think it's part of the equation, it's part of what we're talking about. And actually, you mentioned, it's so dense, we could talk hours about these things, but you mentioned some key concepts that we've been always kind of looking up to, cradle to cradle, and, power shifts and leadership at the community level, and so on and so forth. There is one concept that always attracted me, and that we know that some of our common friends are actually trying to bring this kind of change in the places they live. In Africa, for instance, if we talk about some common friends in Zimbabwe. So the notion of detaching local communities from the grid, so making them autonomous in terms of producing energy, producing food, having their own local currency, so not being attached to national currencies or international exchange. And that, in effect, we will let them reappropriate themselves of that power that they are now missing. So this is a bit controversial, as of course, for a person in government or for a person with your role, but I would love to hear your thoughts, and maybe in 1,000 years, when you're not going to be in government anymore, what do you think about this notion?
Well, I certainly couldn't survive 1,000 years of this or anything, but I mean, obviously New Zealand is a very different kind of set of circumstances than Zimbabwe, which, where we were talking about. And yet, there are clearly examples here where people are trying to work out things like localized food production, some of which is happening in the middle of our cities. So people are taking over kind of spare lots. There's a great place near my where I live in Wellington, where somebody's taken over a community group has taken over an old bowling green, and they've dug it up and turned it into a community garden. And it has far more people participating in it now as a community vegetable garden than it ever did as a bowling green. And they have events there in the facilities and so on. Those marae that I was telling you about, where the indigenous communities have their kind of centres, there is a strong move in those for putting in place solar plus batteries and so on, so that they are self-sufficient in energy. Many of them have their own food production. Many of them have housing, that's sort of community-owned housing for their older people to support them. They call papakainga housing. I think that there are some great examples there. And actually, the indigenous tribes, some of our businesses, some of our local authorities are more ambitious on climate change than central government is. And so they're kind of pulling us, not everywhere in the country. You've got some of those cultural issues, you've got areas that are more conservative, areas that are more progressive. But there is something in the indigenous worldview that is far more holistic, far more multi-generational, and thinks about economic activity far more in terms of well-being than in terms of a financial return, but sees a financial return over a very long period of time as critically important in order to be able to sustain well-being for all of their people and all of their children and their children. And so that's changing non-Indigenous owned businesses where you've got other companies that are kind of going, hey, I kind of like the idea of a 500-year business plan that looks after our people and our planet. That seems more interesting to me than, generating a superior Q4 return. And so that's, I think, I don't think there's a single answer out there, right? I mean, it feels to me like there's all of these experiments going on, and that is a really good thing because you need a diversity of experiments will be to kind of and apply them more generally, across the whole country as well.
That's fantastic, James. I think it brings out the concept of diversity as well, the diversity of experimentations, the diversity of approaches. It's a wealth that should be probably cultivated more in order to then being able to replicate where it works, or to make it a shared wealth across territories and across the country. I also like to invite the audience, if they've got any questions, they can either place them on the Facebook chat where we go live, or they can write them in the Q&A function here for those who are in our same Zoom room. But I have at least another couple of questions that I'd like to ask James. Going back to the vision from a state, or what the nation state can do to enable this transformation. I think one big question is, how do you fund this? Because if we pass the notion that this is a very good investment for the future, when you think in terms of multi-generational, long-term view as you do, how do you fund this transformation in terms of infrastructures, in terms of subsidies to businesses to acquire new technologies to make them more sustainable, and so on and so forth? And I know that you have been instrumental in launching in New Zealand a 100 million venture capital fund in order to support this transformation. And I think it's a very interesting example that the government actually starts a venture capital fund. Can you tell us a little bit how you did it and how it works?
Sure. I'll just start by saying, your question, how do we fund it all? My finance minister has been asking me that question a lot recently. So I think,
I bet.
Open to ideas. So my, okay. So the venture capital fund it's actually slightly later stage capital. It's more about scaling up capital. So, and we felt that in New Zealand, there not a lot of activity driving really strongly towards the low carbon economy. Lots of experiments going on, lots of startups, but nothing really happening at the scale that we need. And again, when you look at the big shifts in transport and agriculture and energy, it requires economy-wide scale. And we've got reasonably thin capital markets, but they're sufficient enough to be able to make a difference if that capital is deployed in the right way, or in ways that are useful rather than passively. But not a lot of fund managers whose specialist knowledge is in kind of green tech or the transition economy or things like that. And so we felt that and also there is some market failures, right? So I'll give you an example. If you retrofit a commercial building to make, if you take a sort of a crappy old 1960s commercial block, office block, which is really energy inefficient, and you retrofit it, you strip it back to the core, you redo, all of the windows, do all the wiring, do all the water and waste and so on and so forth, then that can generate quite a significant return on that investment from about the 7th year onwards, right? It takes about 7 years to recover the capital. But at least here, most property investors are looking for a 5-year return. And so, not a lot of people were doing this. And so having a green investment fund allows you with a mandate for decarbonisation as well as a mandate for generating a return, is that they can play a part to kind of bridge gaps in the market. So you can say to the commercial investors, hey, look, you can still get your return in the first 5 years. We'll be the patient capital that waits until years 6 and 7, and then we'll get our return. And so you make a deal which kind of uses traditional finance to solve one of these market failures. But in order to do that, you need kind of specialist knowledge about, that kind of opportunity. And so we'd said, well, let's set up a direct investment house. We put $100 million into it a few years ago. We actually put another $300 million into it in the last budget. So it's quadrupled in size. It's now $400 million. And that's starting to get to the scale where it's able to participate in much bigger projects and take more significant risks. And so it's starting to, fund large-scale solar rollouts around the country and all sorts of interesting things like that. That obviously requires an injection of capital, $400 million. But because it is an investment firm, it sits as an asset on our books. Because it's supposed to generate a return, even a modest return over time, it'll be worth more than the 400 million that we put in. So it balances out on the government's books. And I do think that given the scale of what needs to happen, we need to apply that mindset all the time, because there's not enough tax money in the world to fund all of the things that need to happen, without generating for some things some kind of return. Now there are areas, of course, which have to happen, which aren't commercial, and so you need to be really clear about what can generate a return that you can marshal the kind of capital markets towards, but also really clear about the things that actually this is really important. We're going to have to put some money into it, and that's just part of what government can do, because we're the largest operator in the country. We occupy about 30% of GDP, and so sometimes in a fairly small country like ours, there are things that only the government can do, and we just need to be really clear-eyed about which category of things that we're doing. The other thing I think it's really important when you say, well, how are we going to pay for all of this, is that I think it really is part of the polluter pays principle. Says, well, if you're an emitting entity, if you're a business that puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, then you're going to need to pay to continue to do that, and you can then plough that revenue into the transition. And we weren't doing a lot of that until recently. We've had an emissions trading scheme, but it was really weak and didn't actually generate any reductions in emissions, which you would think that an emissions trading scheme was supposed to do. It also didn't generate any revenue, so there was nothing that we could plough back into the transition. But we've changed those things now, and it's starting to perform those functions.
Thank you, James. Congratulations.
Sorry.
Yes.
Can I go one more? Sorry, you got me talking about finance, which if you've known me as long as you have, you'd know was not my mastermind specialist subject. The other one is when it comes to debt, government debt, is really starting to shift, because you've got this massive and growing green bond market where you're able to get at least a marginally better rate that you need to repay the capital on, if you put in place, certain, or if the money is going towards funding the transition, and that the availability of capital in the green bond market is absolutely staggering, and it's growing at an exponential rate. And so what that suggests is that countries and businesses and local governments that want to borrow to invest in the transition will be able to get capital to do that. I mean, you still have to operate within your kind of regular, however you manage debt generally. But I think the idea that money comes with outcomes is a really good one.
And I agree with that. And there are two things that struck me about this, this excellent practice that you have developed. Congratulations for quadrupling the funds on your venture capital fund. One is that we need to get into place mechanisms for investment that are more patient than what the market is in terms of expectations on return on investment, because otherwise the long-term view that we need to take doesn't match with the short-term gains that the market expects. So there is something in there that we need to do or to make happen to shift that. So to have maybe perhaps, the possibility to allocate more funds to the investment needed to transform our economies. And then the other side is this interesting distinction you made between, what, a nation state can fund with this multiplier effect or return on investment principle that the market will help to make happen. On the other side, what the state has to do because nobody else will. So that this distinction is very important. You need to understand which is which in order to apply all the leverages that you can apply. There is one interesting question from the audience that I want to share with you. There is when we talk about climate change, is it possible to get an agreement across the political divide? Is it possible to conceive also in countries in which there is extreme polarization? And I would say that probably in Europe is, the polarization is increasing between left and right. How is it possible to get an agreement about this long-term view and about climate change in your perspective?
Yeah, look, this is a question that preoccupies me, and it has actually governed much of the way that I've operated in the 4 years that I've been doing this job. So in the previous term of government, the main focus was to put in place the institutional framework and the legal framework for the transition. And so we passed something called the Zero Carbon Act. And the Zero Carbon Act has as its purpose for New Zealand to operate within 1.5 degrees of global warming. So we've got to basically manage our economy in a pathway that's consistent with that. Puts in place the 2050 target of net zero emissions for carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and a methane reduction. And then sets up a framework for 5-year emissions budgets. So, you kind of have these stepping stones for managing the short term, but within a long-term context. And it's a model actually that we borrowed from the United Kingdom, which has actually worked really well for them. And we had quite a lot of support from them. Now, we're a left-wing government, and we replaced a conservative government in 2017. And we actually managed to work with them to construct this legal framework to the point that when we passed the law, we passed it unanimously in the Parliament. So we had nobody voted against it at the final reading. And that was a huge signal to our business community. In fact, literally the next day, one of our big energy companies decided to double the size of an investment in a wind farm because they like, okay, we know which way things are going now. And if the government changes in the future, we still know. So that was singularly important. And I think one of the things for our Conservative Party, our more right-wing parties, that was really important was that the business community were saying they needed some kind of predictability and certainty around the long-term policy, because not only were they not investing in the green economy, they also weren't investing in the dirty economy, because they didn't know any 3 or 6 years which way the government was going to go. And, you know, if we're going to deploy $2 billion building a, you know, smokestack, and then you get a kind of environmentalist government who, you know, render that investment worthless, or if we decide that we're going to really invest in carbon forestry or something like that, and then you get a right-wing government that doesn't care about climate change and they destroy that investment. So a lot of capital was being held back. And, you know, our main opposition Conservative Party, they're very concerned with the opinions of the business world. So that I think was a really important lever to pull. And I think it was important for us in government on the left to understand that dynamic and to kind of work with it. Having said that, in this term of Parliament, you know, that main opposition party are taking a much more polarized, less bipartisan approach. And partially that's to do with their own internal dynamics, but partially it's because, you know, COVID-19 has strained the social fabric. And so it's very tempting when you're in opposition to kind of exploit that to try and rebuild your vote for the next election. And so that's starting to affect their climate policy as well. And so I've got all these nervous people in the business community coming to me, a green, saying, well, you know, are we going to be able to maintain the consensus? To which I generally say, well, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask. But it takes two to tango, as we say. And so, you know, we're just going to have to see how that plays out. But I think it is, you know, when you're in a position of power, as we are at the moment, I think one way to try and build consensus is by, you know, operating is by inviting others into that power, you know, and kind of coming from a more open and more sharing approach, because that sort of makes it safe for them to participate. And, you know, I also recognize New Zealand is in a very different set of circumstances from a lot of other countries. You know, I look at Australia, who culturally in many ways are very similar to New Zealand, and on climate change policy, you know, we're pretty far apart. And that's because the partisanship in the Australian political system is really toxic, you know, and it affects everything.
Well, the reality of politics versus policy. And I think that's a dynamic we need to all live with. And I also appreciated the fact that, you know, you can create a policy framework that tries to really look long-term and tries to provide a stable direction for both, you know, industrial development and societal development. And that's what, you know, you have done, certainly. There is a question from Karina Lucinkina that, you know, we are happy that, Karina, you are with us in this talk. The question is, what do you expect from COP26? Would be the best outcome? What will be the best outcome from the meeting, from your perspective?
Yeah. Look, it's the situation's pretty grim. I think what I would like to see, and I hold out some hope for, but it is not probable, is a kind of a rebuilding of the momentum around the Paris Agreement. And, you know, one of the most critical aspects of the Paris Agreement was that there was essentially a deal between the developed countries, like, you know, Europe and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the United States and others, and the developing world, in which the developed world would commit to marshal $100 billion a year, essentially of development and aid towards the developing countries to help them with the transition. And in return, the developing world said that they would also accept emissions reductions targets for their economies. And frankly, the developed world hasn't delivered on that commitment. And that has produced both a real sense of suspicion by the developing world towards the developed world, which is kind of understandable. But also it's allowed countries, particularly the petro-states, that really want to undermine and relitigate the Paris Agreement. It's given them the opportunity to do that. It's given them a sort of a fertile ground in which to kind of sow discord and chaos. And you can see that happening. And so it's it's a pretty tough environment right now. Having said that, you've had some pretty big announcements recently. The US made a very significant increase in their commitment. New Zealand is going to be increasing our commitment. The European Union put, billions of dollars more on the table the other day to try and get us up to that 100 billion, essentially as a marker of good faith upon which we can try and rebuild the kind of the energy and the collective mission around Paris. And if we can do that, to me, that would be a win.
Very clear, thanks. James,
nice to hear from you, Karina.
James, we recognize it's late for you, but we have at least another question from the audience, if you're willing to take it.
I'm fine. Parliament doesn't rise until 10 o'clock at night, and it's only 20:09 here, so.
Okay, great.
I have oodles of time.
Great. So the question comes from one of our researchers in the, we deal a lot with labor market evolution and the skills required by the labor market. So the question is that the great transformation is already and will increasingly so change the set of skills that workers will need in a changed labor market. Do you have any hints on what we're already seeing happening, at least in the New Zealand labor market, or what do you envision being the skills that will be required more in the future? Yeah,
golly, that is a really good question. So I think there's some of it which is fairly kind of mainstream or orthodox, right? So within industries, one of the things that we talk about when it comes to a just transition is the idea that you don't want to ask a coal miner to become a barista. That's, first of all, being a barista is an honorable profession, but it doesn't pay as well as mining. And second of all, you're talking in many cases about people who have had generations, I may be a coal miner, but my dad was a coal miner and my grandfather was a coal miner, and so on. So there's a deep sense of identity around my profession. And so we've got an obligation, if we're going to be asking people to undertake this transition, to make sure that we take everybody with us, we don't leave anyone behind, but also that we're looking to invest in new industries that utilize similar skills and that we support people through those transitions. And so we've got a sunset industry like oil and gas or coal that we're actively looking to find new sustainable industries which have internal transferability. So one of the things that we're looking at the moment here in Aotearoa is the idea of a fairly significant hydrogen economy. We produce effectively no hydrogen of our own at the moment, but it is good for storing energy. It's good for heavy vehicles. It's one of the options being looked at for shipping and for aviation. And Japan, an export market for us, is making a very big play on hydrogen. So we're considering, building hydrogen processing using hydroelectric and wind power and so on. So essentially an entirely clean fuel. And that requires the same kinds of skills that you find in the oil and gas industry. And so, because it's about pipes and it's about pressure and it's about liquids and gases that move through those pipes and so on. And I've spoken to people in the oil and gas industry who say, well, we don't really care what flows through our pipes. We're just really good at pipes. And so, the question is, how do you make those transitions? And I think that really involves an active labour market policy. It involves active investment in those new industries. It involves getting your formal education lined up. It involves your social security system aligning to support people through those transitions. And I think the tripartite model that's most common in Europe between government and unions and industry is critical to the transitions. You can kind of get away with it just, in a steady state. But when you've got the kind of shift that we're talking about, I would say that's at the heart of it. When it comes to other things, there's stuff that we don't know what we don't know about the future. And so having really great education, having, a well-supported entrepreneur environment, having great kind of angel investors and kind of early stage investors who are prepared to put risk capital up to support experimentation. You don't necessarily know what you're going to be good at in the future. And so I think having a really fertile ground to support innovation, research, science, technology, and kind of rapid startups and rapid failures is also really important.
That's a great answer. Thank you, James. Actually, I was reading recently an interesting article on the idea that in order to contrast global warming, one good possible remedy strategy would be to capture carbon. And there is some new plans being developed around the world. And the article was making the claim that the only industry that could scale that up very rapidly and very efficiently, it's actually the oil industry. So we should actually, give them the mandate to shift from petrol to carbon capture, and that will be, will make a great contribution to global warming reduction. I don't know if you agree with this view. It's an interesting view.
I do. I mean, when you think about it, we've gone from having about safe level of about 260 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere before the Industrial Revolution to about 420 parts per million. So the amount of carbon, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is close to double what it was 200 years ago. And, we need to stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as fast as we can, just stop putting it up there in the first place. But even if you turned off every car, every industry tomorrow, you'd still be at 420 parts per million concentration. You've still got the warming effect of everything that we've put up into the atmosphere over the last 200 years. So you've got to take some of that back out of the atmosphere. And at the moment, planting trees is a very, reliable and tried and tested way of doing that. And we're planting hundreds of millions of trees all over New Zealand. But I don't think that we're going to be able to get back to 260 parts per million with afforestation alone. I think we're going to have to use mechanical means as well in order to supplement that. My caution with carbon capture is that it's an idea that came from the oil and gas industry, essentially to say, well, we'll keep sticking carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and we'll also have machines to take it out of the atmosphere. And so you don't need to worry about us anymore. We can just keep the old machine going. And actually that's not true. You've got to be pulling more out than you put in. That's the hard part, but it's starting to work, right? I mean, I was talking to a Canadian carbon capture company 3 weeks ago, and they are working with one of the big oil majors in North America. They're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and then they're storing it underground. and they're turning it into zero carbon fuels and all sorts of stuff. So we're only just at the very start of that, but I think it will be a feature in the future.
Thank you, James. We have a question from Dio, if you remember.
I do. I was wondering if that's the Dio that we know. Hello.
So question is, how do we ensure that the developing world are a willing and meaningful participant in these conversations and actions? It's a big question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this sort of comes back to what I was saying before. I think the developed world needs to take more responsibility than we have for the part that we need, that we need to play, and that's both. So, wealthier countries that did well out of the Industrial Revolution need to reduce our emissions, not just on the kind of average reduction, but well above the average reduction, and that's. I think an obligation that's baked into the Paris Agreement, and what that does is it means that your less well-off countries that didn't do so well out of the Industrial Revolution, that often lost a lot of their resources during the colonial period to the developed world, countries that are now in the developed world, that there is not an expectation that they'll be able to do that kind of global average in terms of reductions. But between us, we do hit the kind of level that's required. So we need to go further and faster in the developed world, and I think that builds trust and it creates space for developing countries, makes them more likely to participate if they feel that everybody else is pulling their weight according to their national circumstances. And then that other thing that I was saying about making sure that the finance to support the transition is available. And I think, as with all of these things, this is a colossal collective effort. But those with, power and money, we need to be able to give some of that up in order to create space for everybody to participate equally, I think. There's a kind of I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but to me, that's the kind of the basic principle. Otherwise, we're just not going to get there.
It's interesting that you point the finger on things such as trust and reliability. That I think it's actually what's really required beyond, the dynamics of diplomacy and international trade and so on and so forth. I think at the end of the day, human dynamics, also when it comes, to country relationships are at the essence. Okay, we have got the last two questions, and then we promise that we're going to leave you to your evening and family. So the first comes from a colleague of mine. And are you familiar with the Green Deal, with the European Green Deal at all? Yes, you are.
I am, and I mean, I don't know the detail. It was a pretty big package, but
yes, it was.
I was talking to Franz Timmermans about the design of it sometime last year, as they were getting the package through. And I'm also a member of the Global Alliance for a Green New Deal, which Ilhan Omar and others are leading as well, which has got an amazing group of people, many of whom are in the European Parliament or member countries of the European Union.
Great. And last question comes from Alberto that says, how do I apply for a New Zealand citizenship?
Well, look, I have to say right now is not a great time.
Maybe wait a little and then it will be.
Yeah. We've got this, I mean, COVID, has caused chaos, everywhere. And one of the things that it's done for us is it's actually made it quite difficult, even for people who are our own citizens, to get back into New Zealand at the moment. And there are some really heartbreaking stories of people who are kind of caught out overseas when the pandemic hit and are now trying to make it back for, funerals or to see their kind of dying parents and things like that. And it's a tragedy at a kind of population level. And to me, it's going to be very interesting because we've had this very privileged period where certainly for people in my country, it's pretty easy to travel overseas. Fabio and I lived together in London for a number of years and in Brussels. I lived outside New Zealand for 13 years. And I went back every few years and saw my parents. And then all of a sudden, you can't do that anymore. And we haven't had a period like that in the last generation. And so it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see as we get vaccinated and we start reopening the borders and travel starts to resume, whether we'll just revert to where we were, or whether the crisis of these 2 years will fundamentally reshape things. And for the life of me, I couldn't work out. I think, I'll tell you what, I'll swap you. If I can get Italian citizenship so I can come hang out sometime, I'll do you a deal.
I think it's a good deal. We'll send you Alberto and you come in his place to Italy. I think it would be good to us, for us. James, I think the question actually was not just a joke, because you represented a country, New Zealand, that is playing a leading role globally when it comes to paving the way for the great transformation we'll be talking about today. And that is, of course, a big, you played a big part in this. And so we want to thank you for this, congratulate you for your achievements, wish you good luck for the remainder of your mandate, and thank you so very much for dedicating us your time today and joining us in this talk. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My absolute pleasure. It's lovely to see you. And again, thank you to all of my friends and people I've not met who have tuned in. It's really great for me to have the opportunity to share this with you. Lovely to see you too, Fabio. I'll see you soon.
Yes, we'll see you in Europe for COP26. Thank you, James. Have a good evening.
You too. Ciao, ciao.
Bye to everybody. Bye-bye.